My stepfather watched his dogs tear my cat apart and drank his beer while I screamed. I was 14. It was 20 below zero, Montana winter, the kind of cold that turns your lungs to glass and makes the snow squeak like styrofoam under your boots. I'd woken to the sound of howling, not wolves, though I'd learned to love that sound later. Calvin's dogs. 12 of them. Mastiffs, Rottweilers, wolf hybrids he'd bred himself for property protection, though I'd never seen them protect anything that wasn't already theirs. I ran outside in my socks. The snow burned my feet instantly, but I didn't feel it. I was looking for Mist. Mist was my mother's cat. A gray Persian, deaf from birth, rescued from a breeder who'd planned to drown her for the defect. My mother had saved her, named her, loved her with the ferocity of someone who'd been told she was disposable and chose to live anyway. When the cancer took my mother 6 months earlier, Mist was all she'd left me. The only family I had, the only thing in that house that remembered her voice. I'd found a window broken that evening, Calvin's accidental damage, though I knew better. He hated Mist. Hated her silence, her softness, the way she slept on my pillow and purred in a frequency only I could feel. Cats are for weak women, he'd said, the first week I was there. We have dogs here. Real dogs. Mist had gotten out. She was deaf. She couldn't hear the dogs coming. I found them in the dog yard, a fenced acre of mud and ice and shit behind the barn. The pack had her cornered against the fence. She was hissing, her gray fur puffed to twice its size, her deafness making her brave in a way that broke my heart. She didn't know what they were. She didn't know what was coming. I screamed. I ran toward them. I didn't have shoes, a coat, a weapon. I had my voice and my 14-year-old body and the absolute certainty that I would die before I let them take her. Calvin was on the porch. He was wearing his shearling coat, the one that cost more than my mother's car, holding a can of beer that steamed in the cold. He saw me. He saw them. He didn't move. Call them off, I screamed. Call them off. He took a sip. He smiled. Cats don't survive out here, Sage. Lesson you need to learn. I reached the fence. I climbed it. The barbed wire tearing my nightgown, my palms. I dropped into the yard. The dogs turned. One of them, a brindle mastiff named Bruiser, lunged. I kicked him in the chest. He backed off, surprised, but the others were circling, and Mist was still in the corner, still hissing, still not understanding. I got between her and them. I spread my arms. I screamed every curse my mother had never let me say, every word I'd learned in the hospital watching her fade, every sound that wasn't a prayer because I didn't believe in anything that would let this happen. Bruiser bit my thigh. I felt the pressure, then the pain, then the wet warmth of blood on my leg. Another dog, a hybrid with yellow eyes like a wolf's, caught my forearm. I went down. The snow was red where I fell. I could still see Mist, could still reach for her, but the dogs were on me now, and I was going to die, and Calvin was still on the porch. Still drinking, still watching. He whistled, too short, one long. The dogs stopped. They retreated, whining, disappointed, their jaws wet with my blood. I lay in the snow, my leg throbbing, my arm numb, and I watched Calvin walk toward me. He didn't hurry. He didn't look at Mist. He stood over me, his boots inches from my face, and he finished his beer. Like I said, he repeated. Cats don't survive here. You want to end up like her, keep trying to save things that can't be saved. I turned my head. Mist was in the corner still. Her fur was no longer puffed. Her eyes were open, reflecting the porch light, the moon, the nothing. She didn't look like she'd suffered. She looked like she'd been surprised by the ending. Like she'd expected something else from a world she'd only known through my hands. Calvin walked back to the house. The dogs followed him, tails wagging, expecting treats. I lay in the snow until I couldn't feel my feet, until the blood stopped flowing, until I understood that if I didn't move, I would die here, and he would bury me beside her, and no one would ever know. I crawled to her. I picked her up. She was still warm. I carried her to the barn, to the hayloft where I'd hidden from him before, and I held her until she was cold, until I was cold, until there was no difference between us. In the morning, he found me there. He made me bury her. The ground was frozen 6 inches down. He gave me a shovel with a broken handle and stood at the barn door, arms crossed, while I chipped at the earth with bleeding hands. Hard ground, he said, builds character. Coal women, sorry, Voss women need character. I didn't look at him. I dug. I hit frost, then gravel, then something harder that might have been another animal, another lesson, another child he'd broken before me. I made a hole deep enough for her body, shallow for my grief. I wrapped her in my nightgown, the one the dogs had torn, the one stained with my blood, and I covered her with dirt that wouldn't accept her, that rose in lumps and ridges like a body refusing to be buried. When I finished, he inspected my work. He kicked the mound with his boot. That'll do, he said, now get inside. You're tracking blood on my floors. I walked past him. I didn't limp, though my leg was on fire. I didn't hold my arm, though the bite had gone to the bone. I walked like my mother had walked the last month when the pain was everywhere and she refused to show it. I walked like a woman who had decided, in some part of herself that even cruelty couldn't reach, that this was not the end. That night I found his wolf skulls. He kept them in the basement, on shelves he'd built himself, trophies from 20 years of predator control. 200 skulls, he'd told a visitor once, though I'd thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. The basement was a charnel house, a museum of death, each skull labeled with a date and a location. The oldest were coyotes, then wolves, then, in recent years, hybrids, dogs that had gone feral, anything with cannid DNA that crossed his property line. And on the top shelf, separate, special, a female wolf skull with a collar still attached. A collar I recognized. Green nylon with a bell. The collar I'd put on Mist 2 weeks before she died, because Calvin had accidentally let her out once already and I'd wanted to hear her if she escaped again. He'd used her collar. He'd used my cat's collar as bait, as a lure, as a way to attract wolves to his traps. And then he'd kept it, displayed it, as proof that he could take what I loved and turn it into what he killed. I stood in that basement, surrounded by death, holding my own blood in my palms, and I made a promise. Not to God. Not to my mother, not even to Mist, though I whispered her name. I promised the wolves, the ones he'd killed, the ones whose skulls watched me from the shelves. I promised them that I would come back, that I would learn them, that I would use what they were, family, structure, patience, to destroy what he was. Then I went upstairs. I cleaned my wounds with whiskey and thread. I packed my bag, and I waited 3 years for my escape. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're here, maybe you know what it means to bury something you loved in ground that refuses it. Maybe you know the particular cold of watching someone destroy your only softness and call it strength. Maybe you know what it's like to promise revenge not to a person, but to a species, to a whole kingdom of the living that someone decided was disposable. If that's you, subscribe. Not because I have comfort, because I have a whistle that wolves answer, and because the story I'm about to tell you ends with me standing in a federal vehicle, watching my stepfather's dogs turn on him, while the wolf he tried to eradicate sat beside me and waited. Here's my story. I left at 17. Not ran, left. A scholarship to study wildlife biology at the University of Montana, funded by a conservation group that didn't know my name and wouldn't have cared if they did. I took nothing from Calvin's house. Not clothes, not money, not the photograph of my mother that he'd hidden in his desk drawer, the one he looked at when he thought no one was watching. I took only what was in my head. The skulls, the collar, the sound of Mist's last hiss, the feel of frozen ground that wouldn't accept her, and the promise. I became a biologist. Not just any biologist, a wolf specialist. I spent 10 years learning everything Calvin had spent his life denying. That wolves are not killers but families, that they don't attack humans, that they strengthen ecosystems, that the cattle they destroy are usually already dead, already diseased, already failed by the ranchers who blame predators for their own incompetence. I worked in Yellowstone, tracking the Druid Peak Pack, watching them raise pups, hunt elk, survive winters that should have killed them. I worked in Idaho, where hunters shot them from helicopters and called it sport. I worked in Canada, where they were safer, where I learned that safe is just another word for not yet found. And everywhere I went, I heard Calvin's name. Not from me, I never spoke it, but from ranchers, from politicians, from game wardens who'd given up. Calvin Voss, the man who'd stopped every reintroduction effort in our county, who'd sued the federal government 12 times, who'd had 2 wildlife agents fired for harassment after they found his poison baits. He was famous in a certain circles, a hero to the predator control movement, a martyr to ranching rights, a man who defended his livelihood against government overreach and environmental extremists. I learned, through professional channels, that he'd expanded his operation. He was still poisoning, now with Compound 1080, a lethal toxin banned in most countries but available to certified ranchers. He was still hunting, though he'd switched to night vision scopes and suppressors, the better to avoid witnesses. And he was selling wolf pelts, skulls, canines, gallbladders, a Chinese medicine market I'd never heard of where the bile of apex predators was worth more than gold. Calvin had found a niche. He was killing federally protected animals and selling their bodies internationally, and no one had stopped him because he owned the sheriff, the prosecutor, and half the county commission. I also learned about Diablo. Diablo was his breeding female. A husky wolf hybrid, three-quarters wolf by my estimate, though Calvin claimed she was pure Malamute. She was the mother of his hunting pack, the source of the yellow-eyed hybrids that had killed Mist. She was kept in a kennel behind the barn, bred every season, her pups taken at 6 weeks to be trained into weapons. Calvin loved Diablo, not the way you love a dog, the way you love a gun, a tool, an extension of your own capacity for death. He'd been photographed with her 100 times at political rallies, at cattlemen's conventions, at the state capitol where he lobbied for predator management funding. Diablo was his weakness. The one thing he cared about more than money. The one thing he thought proved his connection to the wild, his dominance over nature, his right to kill. I knew what I had to do. I returned to the county at 27. Not as Sage Voss, that name was poison here. The problem girl who'd run away, who'd abandoned her family, who'd never appreciated what Calvin did for her. I returned as Dr. Sage Merrick, federal wildlife consultant, specialist in wolf reintroduction, assigned to assess the viability of establishing a protected corridor through Calvin's ranch. The assignment was real. I'd engineered it through colleagues who didn't know my history, who thought I was objective, professional, qualified. I was all those things. I was also a woman who'd buried her cat in frozen ground and was ready to bury her stepfather's empire in the same soil. Calvin met me at the property line. He was 6'3" now, heavier, redder, the alcohol and the rage wearing through his face like water through stone. He didn't recognize me. I'd changed, grown, hardened, learned to wear my hair and my clothes and my accent like camouflage. I was blonde now where I'd been dark. I wore glasses I didn't need. I spoke with the flat precision of federal bureaucracy, the voice that said I don't care about your feelings, I care about your compliance. Sage Merrick, I said, extending my hand. Fish and Wildlife Service. We're assessing the northern corridor for potential wolf reintroduction. Your property falls within the proposed range. He shook my hand. His grip was hard, testing. I let him squeeze until my bones protested, then squeezed back harder. With the grip I'd developed hauling wolf carcasses through snow, with the strength of someone who'd buried things that wouldn't stay buried. Voss, he said, squinting, you look familiar. Common name, I said. I'm from Oregon. He nodded, satisfied. He didn't look closely at people anymore. He was too important, too busy, too surrounded by yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear. I was just another government drone, another obstacle to be managed, another story for his next fundraiser. Come on, he said. I'll show you why this corridor's a bad idea. Wolves and cattle don't mix. Never have, never will. I spent 3 months on his property. I documented everything. The poison baits, GPS coordinates, photographs, chemical residue samples. The skull collection, now numbering over 300, kept in a new outbuilding with climate control like a museum. The financial records, accessed through a sympathetic clerk at the county recorder's office, showing transfers to a shell company in Wyoming, then to an exporter in Vancouver, then to buyers in China and Russia. And I documented Diablo. She was kept in a concrete kennel, 10 by 10, with a metal roof and a chain-link fence. She had water, food, veterinary care. Calvin wasn't cruel to her in the ways that mattered to the law. But she was alone, isolated from the pack she'd borne, from the wolves she was, from any life that wasn't production and performance. I visited her at night when Calvin was drinking when the ranch hands were gone. I brought her treats, venison mostly, the kind wolves eat in the wild. I sat outside her kennel and I talked to her, not commands, just voice, presence. The thing Calvin had never given her because he thought dominance was love. She learned my scent, my sound, my shape in the dark. She didn't wag, she wasn't a dog, but she would stand when I approached, press her nose to the fence, inhale deeply. Recognition. Interest, the beginning of trust. And I planned the insemination. It was technically simple. I'd maintained connections with the captive breeding program at a federal facility in Idaho. They had semen from a male wolf, or seven, descendant of the original Yellowstone reintroduction, from a genetic line that had been extirpated from Montana in the 1920s, by men like Calvin, using methods like Calvin's. The line was rare, precious, protected by the Endangered Species Act with the full weight of federal law. I obtained the semen through legitimate channels, a research application, a breeding loan, paperwork that would stand up to any audit. I stored it in liquid nitrogen, transported it in a specialized canister, kept it at the required temperature through 3 weeks of preparation. The insemination itself was the risk. I needed a veterinarian willing to perform the procedure without asking too many questions. I found one, Dr. Alina Vargas, who'd worked with me in Yellowstone, who knew Calvin's reputation, who'd lost 2 wolves to his poison in her first year of practice. She didn't ask why, she just asked when. We did it in November, during a storm that kept Calvin in the house and the ranch hands in town. Alina sedated Diablo, performed the procedure, and we were gone before the snow stopped falling. The whole thing took 40 minutes. The consequences would take 9 months to manifest. I continued my assessment. I smiled at Calvin's jokes. I nodded at his lectures. I ate his steaks and drank his coffee and pretended to consider his evidence that wolves were destroying the West. And all the while, I waited. Diablo gave birth in April, 6 pups. Gray with yellow eyes with the broad heads and long legs of pure wolves. Calvin was furious. He assumed she'd escaped, been bred by a wild male, that his pure Malamute had been ruined. He threatened to drown them, to shoot them, to dispose of the mistake. I intervened. Officially, I discovered the pups during a routine inspection, expressed concern about their unusual phenotype, and took DNA samples for further analysis. Calvin, not knowing what I knew, agreed. He thought I was documenting a problem, building a case against wild wolves, proving that even controlled animals could be contaminated. I sent the samples to a federal lab. I waited 2 weeks. The results came back: 99.7% Canis lupus. Pure wolf. Federally protected. Illegally possessed on private property without permits, without registration, without the licenses Calvin had spent 20 years avoiding. I didn't act immediately. I waited for the pups to be weaned, to be mobile, to be visible. I documented Calvin's threats, recorded on my phone, transcribed, filed. I built the case not just for possession but for intent. He had planned to kill endangered animals, had said so repeatedly, had been stopped only by my intervention. And then I made the call. The raid happened at 4:00 a.m. Federal agents, Fish and Wildlife, FBI, EPA, in a coordinated operation I'd helped plan through back channels, using evidence I'd compiled over months. They had warrants for the poison, the skulls, the financial records, the unregistered weapons. They had a separate warrant for the pups, as evidence of a federal wildlife violation. Calvin woke to dogs barking, lights in the yard, voices on loudspeakers. He came out with his rifle, the same one he'd used to shoot wolves from his porch, the same one he'd pointed at me once when I was 14 and he'd found me in his basement with the skulls. He didn't point it at the agents. He pointed it at the kennel, at Diablo, at the pups. "I'll kill them first," he screamed, "before I let you take them. They're mine, I made them." The agents froze. They had rules of engagement. They couldn't fire unless fired upon. And Calvin was between them and the kennel, his rifle aimed at 6 animals that were, by law, federal property. I was in the lead vehicle. I stepped out. I walked toward him, my hands visible, my voice calm. "Mr. Voss," I said, "lower the weapon. The pups are protected. If you harm them, you're looking at federal charges that no local judge can reduce." He turned. He saw me. And for a second, a long, terrible second, he didn't recognize me. I was just another government suit, another enemy in a lifetime of enemies. Then he did, the glasses, the blonde hair, the eyes, my mother's eyes, the ones he'd stared at in his desk drawer when he thought no one was watching. "Sage," he whispered, "you little bitch, you did this." "I did," I said. "I came back for Mist, for my mother, for every skull in your basement. And I brought the wolves you tried to kill, Calvin. I brought them right into your kennel. And now they're going to take everything you have." He raised the rifle, not at the pups, at me. The dogs stopped him. Not Diablo, she was in the kennel behind him, unable to reach him, but the pack. The 12 hunting dogs, the ones he'd trained to kill on command, to attack anything he designated as threat. They'd been released by a ranch hand who'd panicked at the raid, who'd opened their run rather than face federal charges for holding them. They came around the barn in a wave. Bruiser, the mastiff who'd bitten my thigh, the yellow-eyed hybrid who'd taken my arm. The others, names I'd never learned, faces I'd never forget. They smelled the wolves in the kennel. They smelled the blood, mine still after all these years, in their memories. They smelled Calvin's fear, the chemical signal of a leader who'd lost control. They didn't attack me. I'd been gone too long, changed too much, but they knew Calvin, they knew his fear, and they'd been trained their whole lives to attack what he feared. Bruiser hit him first, took him in the chest, knocked him down. The others followed. Not a coordinated attack, a feeding frenzy, the kind Calvin had bred them for, the kind he'd used on Mist. They went for his arms, his legs, his face. He screamed. He dropped the rifle. He tried to crawl toward the kennel, toward Diablo, toward the only creature he'd ever shown anything like love. She watched him through the fence. She didn't move, she didn't howl, she just watched. With yellow eyes that were wolf eyes, that were my eyes, that were the eyes of every animal he'd ever killed and never understood. The agents fired warning shots. The dogs scattered, retreated, whined. Calvin lay in the dirt, bleeding from a dozen wounds, his rifle beside him, his empire ending in the same dog yard where mine had ended 14 years earlier. I walked to him. I knelt. I didn't touch him. I just looked, the way he'd looked at me in the snow, the way he'd looked at mist in the corner, the way he'd looked at every living thing he'd decided was weaker than him. The cats don't survive here, I said. You taught me that. But you forgot the rest of the lesson, Calvin. The wolves remember. The wolves always remember. He tried to speak. Blood bubbled at his lips. I stood up. I walked to Diablo's kennel. I opened the gate. She walked out, slow, uncertain, her pups following in a line of gray fur and yellow eyes. She didn't run. She didn't attack. She just walked past Calvin, past the agents, past the chaos of his ending, and she stopped at my side. I put my hand on her head. She leaned into it. The first time she'd ever touched a human without a fence between them. The first time she'd chosen. Calvin was arrested, not by me, but by the agents who'd watched everything. He was taken to a hospital, then to a federal facility, then to a courtroom where he faced 25 years for wildlife trafficking, poaching, fraud, and illegal possession of endangered species. He died in prison 3 years later, an infection from his wounds, untreated because he'd lost his connections, his money, his ability to make the world bend to his will. I didn't attend the funeral. I was busy. The ranch became a sanctuary. Not immediately, there were legal battles, environmental assessments, negotiations with the state. But eventually the land was transferred to a conservation trust, funded by the federal settlement from Calvin's assets. The dog yard was demolished. The skulls were buried in a memorial mound, marked with a single stone. They were not trophies, they were family. Diablo and her pups became the foundation of a new pack. Not wild, they'd been born in captivity, too habituated to survive without support. But free, in a sense that mattered. They had territory, they had structure. They had humans who brought them food and respected their space and never ever pointed a rifle at them. I lived nearby in a cabin I'd built with my own hands, on land I'd bought with money I'd earned honestly. I had 2 cats, both gray Persians, both deaf, both rescues from breeders who'd planned to drown them. I named them Mist and Ghost, and they slept on my pillow, and they purred in frequencies only I could feel. And I had Luna. Luna was one of Diablo's daughters. The smallest, the darkest, the one who'd been born last and fought hardest for her first breath. She'd chosen me at 6 months, following me from the sanctuary boundary to my cabin, sleeping on my porch, eventually sleeping on my bed. She wasn't a pet. She wasn't tame. She was a wolf who'd decided, for reasons I didn't fully understand, that I was worth her presence. We ran together every morning. Through the meadow, into the woods, up the ridge where you could see the mountains and the sky and nothing of what Calvin had built. She was faster than me always, but she'd stop and wait, her yellow eyes watching, her ears forward, making sure I was still there, still following, still part of her pack. Every winter, on the anniversary of Mist's death, I walked to the old barn. The dog yard was gone, replaced by a garden where wildflowers grew in summer. But I knew where she'd been buried, where Calvin had made me dig, where the ground had finally softened enough to accept her. I brought Luna. I brought Mist Roman II and Ghost. I sat in the snow, in the cold that had once burned my feet, and I told all of them what had happened, what I'd done, what I'd built from the frozen ground of her ending, and then I howled. Not well, I'm human, my voice is wrong, the pitch is off. But Luna would join me, her voice true and wild and ancient. And sometimes, if the wind was right, if the pack was close, others would answer. The descendants of the wolves Calvin had killed. The family he'd tried to end. The voices he'd never understood because he'd never learned that a wolf's howl is not a threat. It's a map. It's a promise. It's a way of saying we are here, we are still here, and you cannot make us disappear.